Apex predators, sitting at the top of the food chain, play a pivotal role in regulating and maintaining the populations of other species. And while they are beautiful in their own respect, we should never underestimate the sheer strength and destruction that can be inflicted by animals fine-tuned by millions of years of evolution to be the perfect killing machine in their environment. In today's video, we'll be looking at one such unfortunate event where a diver was torn apart and eaten alive in front of his dive partner by not one, but two massive sharks. Here's the story of Rob Temple. On October 14, 1972, three men by the names of Brett Gilliam, Robbie McIlvaine, and Rob Temple set off on a scientific expedition to recover samples for a research project being conducted at Cane Bay on the island of St. Croix's North Shore. The plan was simply to inspect and photograph the deepest project at 210 feet, located on the wall of a steep drop-off. Temple was the dive leader and timekeeper, in charge of the paperwork and running the decompression schedule during the ascent. These guys were veterans of hundreds of dives, and this was supposed to be a piece of cake. Gilliam even described the area as having some of the best wall diving location in the whole Eastern Caribbean. And this specific drop-off was only a short boat ride from shore, making it a quick and easy excursion. Or so they thought. They would begin their ill-fated journey down the wall and reach their target location at 210 feet. Initially, everything seemed to be going just as planned. As Gilliam and McIlvaine worked, Temple would take some time to observe his surroundings, and something would catch his eye. He spotted two white tip sharks, one about 12 feet and the other a bit bigger, swimming in the distance. The oceanic white-tip shark is characterized by their rounded white-tip fins and mainly inhabits the warm temperate seas. They are known for being very bold and curious sharks. They often investigate floating objects, including shipwrecks and debris, which has led to close encounters with humans. This curiosity, combined with its size and strength, is extremely bad news, and these sharks have been known to be aggressive towards humans, and is the main culprit responsible for one of the worst shark attacks in history, ripping and mauling the survivors of the U.S. Indianapolis after it was bombed back in 1945. It's estimated that they are responsible for upwards of 150 deaths in that single situation. Seeing these sharks didn't startle Rob, as they have had plenty encounters with these sharks, working offshore where they bite their equipment and steal cables deployed from their research boats, and even the propellers on occasion. These two sharks would linger around the location, not posing to be a threat, but the divers would keep an eye on these pesky creatures nonetheless as they finished up their task and got ready to ascend. They finished up the required observations, and Rod filled out the field logs on his slate, right on schedule. Robbie started up first and pointed out the sharks again as they swam by him, headed over the corral and down into the sand chute. While recanting the tragic incident, Brett would later say, "I remember thinking how strange it was to see oceanic white tips right here on the wall at Cane Bay. It was kind of like walking off your back porch and seeing an African lion when you expected an alley cat." Brett would follow behind Robbie, and Rod would be the last one trailing behind. Brett would rendezvous with Robbie about 175 feet, just over a ledge, and the two would wait for Rod to join them. While resting on the coral waiting, Robbie would point to his pressure gauge, not wanting to run low on air, as Rod was taking a long time to ascend. Brett would shrug him off, and they would wait for a short while longer. Suddenly, Robbie dropped his extra gear and catapulted himself toward the wall, pointing at a mass of bubble exhaust coming from the deeper water. Panic would start to set in as they thought he might have had a problem with his oxygen supply. Brett would signal to Robbie to ascend while he went down to help Rod, as his air consumption was a lot less. Robbie would give Brett a very anxious OK sign and headed up. While headed down towards Rod, Brett would soon realize the situation was worse than he originally thought. One of the massive 12-foot sharks would savagely attack Rod, tearing into his left thigh, biting off a mouthful each time. He was losing blood at an alarming rate and would desperately try his best to fight the shark off, gorging at its eyes and gills. This was to no avail, however, as 4,000 pounds of bite force was impossible to defend against, especially underwater. To put into perspective, the bite force of an average German Shepherd is anywhere from 230 to 290 pounds per square inch, which is more than capable of overpowering a human. Brett would frantically swim down and attempt to grab his right shoulder harness strap to pull him up. But almost simultaneously, the second shark would emerge and hit Rod in the same leg the first one had attacked previously. They would both frantically try to fight off the sharks as they viciously bit and pulled on Rob. The atmosphere was completely red with blood, and it was almost impossible to see anything else except flashes of jaws and teeth. Suddenly, the sharks would retreat, and Brett would begin to swim upwards as fast as he could along the wall, pulling on Rod's shoulder strap. They would rest on the sandy chute for a second, when Robbie would look down and notice the horrific incident playing out before his eyes. He would then begin to swim down in an attempt to save the duo, when suddenly, the larger 12-foot shark would emerge and begin to ferociously bite into the opposite side of Rod. At this point, the attack had lasted just about a minute, but would have felt like forever as they fought these ancient killers. Rod would go limp in Brett's arm as he's lost so much blood and flesh. The shark would begin to drag both men down at a rapid rate. Brett would try his best to kick and swim, but it was fruitless. They would descend along the wall without control when Brett suddenly felt when Rod regained consciousness and tried one more time to fight off his attacker. This gave him hope as he thought they still had a chance to fight and swim back up. The coral outcropping briefly gave them some protection, and the attack stopped. The sharks would circle the men from about 10 feet when Brett noticed one of the sharks swallow Rod's right leg, while the other consumed a mouthful of flesh it had torn off during the attack, all before his eyes. His heart dropped. It was like being in a horror movie where you're being hunted and eaten by a monster just because. Except this was real, and it wasn't over. He tried pushing Rod into the coral outcropping, hoping it would shield him from further attack when he noticed that Rod was weakly shaking his head and pushing him away, hoping he would save himself. Brett grabbed for his waist harness for a new grip and felt his hand sink into Rod's mutilated torso. There was no harness left to reach for. He had been disemboweled. In a sudden panic and fury, he would grab him and start kicking for the surface, when immediately the sharks would return and start hitting their prey all over again. One would grab his midsection and they would violently pull him from Brett's grasp. There was absolutely nothing he could do. He would watch as the sharks both bite and pull his friend deeper into the abyss. He knew it was over. The attack started at 200 feet and Brett's depth gauge was pegged at 325, but he knew they were way further than that. This was a big problem, as divers need a specific mix of gas the deeper they dive, and even worse, he was low on oxygen and would have not have the luxury to slowly ascend, giving himself time needed for proper decompression. He desperately needed to get to the surface, ASAP, before the sharks returned for him or he ran out of oxygen. This was basically an impossible situation to survive. He would begin kicking for the surface, sucking on the mouthpiece, trying to get as much oxygen as he can to give himself a fighting chance. If I could just focus on kicking, maybe I can make it. Just kick. He thought to himself as he kicked as hard as he could. Before he could make it to the surface, he would start to lose his sense of fear and urgency, and his brain slowly blacked out, and he went unconscious. But miraculously, a small amount of air was in the swimsuit that helped to float his body to the surface after he blacked out. He would regain consciousness and realize he did in fact survive. However, Now he had to get to shore as soon as possible as the effects of decompression sickness would start to set in. He would swim to shore and a couple on their honeymoon waded out and dragged him on the sand. In an incredible burst of good fortune, it turned out the wife was an ER nurse from Florida and understood the pathology of decompression sickness. They got a steady flow of oxygen into him and ran to call the diving emergency numbers on the dive clipboard. He was airlifted to the hospital where he stayed for 2 days and was released after. Robbie's last view of Rod and Brett was as they were dragged over the wall in a cloud of blood by the sharks. He never saw Brett's ascent, and so reported both men killed when he got to shore. It was not until Brett called his dad from the hospital that he knew he had survived. Rod's body would never be recovered, as it was eaten by the creatures, and they would have his memorial service a week later at the beach. Brett would resume diving the day after. This attack in 1972 was widely reported, and shark experts speculate that the oceanic whitetips may have been attracted and then stimulated by the low-frequency sound in the water from the nearby submarine testing. The previous deepest depth that a diver survived a free ascent from was 180 feet. Gilliam was probably closer to 400 feet. He was cited for heroism by the Virgin Islands government for risking his own life to try to save his partner. In 1993, British television produced a special on the incident as part of a series called Dead Men's Tales. Brett would recover, however, he had residual numbness in both hands and legs, substantial hearing loss, and legally blind in his right eye that would persist for the rest of his life. He was professionally involved in the diving industry for 35 years. He retired in 2006. Since beginning diving in 1958, he has logged over 17,000 dives. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you do, don't forget to like and subscribe as it helps out the channel. See you on the next one.